Hey, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing a much requested updated bookshelf tour. I'm going to kick it like an old school bookshelf tour where I go through each book individually so you get to see the cover. And I will of course insert chapters so you can jump around and pick and choose to what you want to see first. Towards the end of the video, I'll also be going through some stacks. So some of my favorite books, some of my most anticipated books, some hidden gems. So I get to discuss some of the books in my collection. So I haven't done an updated bookshelf tour since 2018. I actually couldn't believe it was that long ago, but to be fair, I've gone through a set of bookshelves since then. My original shelves that you would have seen in a lot of my older videos ended up becoming really damaged because I had a leak in my room, so I had to throw them out and I had to get rid of a significant amount of my book collection too, unfortunately, because they were just damaged beyond repair from water and mold. And then for a time being after that, I just had my books stacked against a wall, which was very visually aesthetic, especially for taking Instagram photos, but it was very impractical, and some of my books did end up getting damaged because just the weight of them being stacked on top of each other and just a lot of general wear and tear happened to my books during this 3-year period where I just had them in stacks. So I wouldn't necessarily advise that you do that, especially if you're someone who really looks after your book collection. This is not the way to look after them. So one of the reasons why I never properly invested in actual bookcases is because my room is so small. So I live in an attic room and the only way to get up to it is via a spiral staircase. So my only options for furniture up here is basically flat pack furniture, and I hate flat pack furniture. Not only do I hate putting it together, I just hate it in general. So I used to have a wardrobe, well, not a wardrobe, I used to have a rail that I hung all my clothes on, and I ended up having to choose books over looks. And I ended up going with the Billy IKEA bookshelves. Now, I went with these because they were the cheapest option for what I needed. They are absolutely not my aesthetic, but the only reason why I got them in white is because they were about €20 cheaper than any other colour. And I'm a cheap bitch, and I was doing this on a budget, and I know that I'm not going to be taking these bookshelves with me, so they're just for the time being, and I was like, I'm not going to spend an additional 80 quid just to get a colour I particularly want. With these bookcases, I got additional shelves, so I have 2 extra shelves on each large bookcase and then 1 extra shelf on the half bookcase, just because I knew I was going to need the extra space. And I also really like the visual of having a jam-packed bookshelf. So the shelves are packed really, really tightly. So the way I have my books organized is into genre, and then it's also alphabetical, and it's also height. So first up, I have my classics collection, and then sci-fi and fantasy, my current library loans, and then my contemporary literary fiction and translations. Then I have my horror collection, my manga collection, my graphic novels, and then I have a little bit of extra space for kind of miscellaneous books. So I think I've rattled on about the books and the bookcase long enough, so let's get into the tour. The complete works of William Shakespeare, The Phantom of the Opera and Other Gothic Tales, The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, The Divine Comedy by Dante, White Noise by Don DeLillo, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Greek Myths by Robert Graves, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, Dubliners by James Joyce, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories by H.P. Lovecraft, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki, Ariel by Sylvia Plath, The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, 1984 by George Orwell, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, The Story of Hong Gildong, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Emma by Jane Austen, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Black Tulip, and The Man in the Iron Mask, all by Alexandre Dumas, Uncle Silas by Sheridan Le Fanu, Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Stories by Washington Irving, Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories by M.R. James, The Monk by Matthew Lewis, Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe by Thomas Ligotti, The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell, and Haunted Castles by Ray Russell, Captain Blood by Raphael Sabatini, The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade, The Dark Eidolon and Other Fantasies by Clark Ashton Smith, The Little Demon by Fyodor Sologob, The Death of Ivan Ilyich and Other Stories by Leo Tolstoy, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, Junkie by William S. Burroughs, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, The Pumpkin Eater by Penelope Mortimer, Invitation to a Beheading by Vladimir Nabokov, Requiem for a Dream, and The Room by Hubert Selby Jr., The Face of Another by Kobo Abe, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, The Outsider by Albert Camus, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, I, Claudius by Robert Graves, Hangs a Man by Shirley Jackson, Ulysses by James Joyce, The Trial by Franz Kafka, Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, The Tenant of Walfell Hall by Anne Bronte, Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, Passing by Nella Larson, The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown, Vathek by William Beckford, Zofloya or the Moor by Charlotte Dacre, In the Glass Darkly by Sheridan Lafanu, The Vampire and Other Tales of the Macabre by John Polidori, The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, The Atlas Six and the Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake, Ninth House and Hellbent by Leo Bardugo, Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, The Book Eaters by Sunny Dean, Norse Mythology, American Gods, Anansi Boys, Stardust, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and Coraline, all by Neil Gaiman, Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, Malice by John Gwynne, and Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins, Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, Heretics of Dune, all by Frank Herbert. Then we have The Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb, The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson, Babel by Orif Kwang, Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, Legends and Lattes, and Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldry, The Bookshop and the Barbarian by Morgan Stang, Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher, I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, The Children of Men by P.D. James, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe, Before Your Memory Fades, and Before We Say Goodbye by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, The Poppy War, and The Dragon Republic by Orif Kwang, The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, The Lies of Locke Lamora, Red Seas Under Red Skies, and The Republic of Thieves by Scott Lynch, A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords Part 1 Steel and Snow, A Storm of Swords Part 2 Blood and Gold, A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons Part 1 Dreams and Dust, A Dance of Dragons Part 2 After the Feast, and Fire and Blood, all by George R.R. Martin. Beautiful Star by Yukio Mishima, Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Then we have the Witcher series, starting with The Last Wish, Sword of Destiny, Blood of Elves, Time of Contempt, Baptism of Fire, The Tower of the Swallow, The Lady of the Lake, and Season of Storms, all by Andrew Sapkowski. And finally, The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and that covers all of my sci-fi and fantasy. Moving on to all my contemporary, literary fiction and translated fiction, starting with Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Aw, A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers, Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, Bunny by Mona Awad, The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks, Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion, Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides, The Doll's Alphabet by Camila Gordova, I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman, Cackle by Rachel Harrison, The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes, Girls Against God by Jenny Vall, Paradise Rot by Jenny Vall, Strange Weather in Tokyo, and The Nakano Thrift Shop by Hiromi Kawakami, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, Beloved by Toni Morrison, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, Lapvona, and Eileen, all by Otessa Moshfegh, The Memory Police, Hotel Iris, and The Diving Pool, all by Yoko Ogawa, Perfume by Patrick Suskind, Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell Stevens, The Last Children of Tokyo by Yoko Tawada, and Scattered All Over the Earth, also by Yoko Tawada. Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tujimura, Ghost Music by Ann Yu, Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. Moving on to my tiny non-fiction section, we have Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life by Ruth Franklin, Girls to the Front by Sarah Marcus, Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel, The Year of Magical Thinking, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, The White Album, and South and West, all by Joan Didion, Just Kids, M Train, and The Year of the Monkey by Patti Smith, The Witches, Salem 1692, A History by Stacey Sheaf. And finally, moving on to my horror section, we're going to be starting with Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bastarrica, The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, The Troop by Nick Cutter, Things We Lost in the Fire and Our Share of Night, both by Mariana Enriquez, Witch Bottle by Tom Fletcher, Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia, Come Closer by Sarah Gran, Into the Drowning Deep by Myra Grant, The Year of Witching, and House of Hunger, both by Alexis Henderson, The Final Girl Support Group, and How to Sell a Haunted House, both by Grady Hendrix, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill, and 20th Century Ghosts, also by Joe Hill, The Only Good Indians, My Heart is a Chainsaw, and Don't Fear the Reaper, all by Stephen Graham Jones. Then moving on to Stephen King, we have The Mist, the first book in the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger, Night Shift, Cell, Dreamcatcher, Pet Sematary, The Stand, and finally It, The Twisted Ones, and The Hollow Places, both by T. Kingfisher, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke and Other Misfortunes by Eric LaRocca, The Fisherman by John Langan, Schrader's Chord by Scott Leeds, Things We Say in the Dark by Christy Logan, Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin, I Am Legend, and Hell House, both by Richard Matheson, Slade House by David Mitchell, Piercing by Ryu Murakami, The Ritual by Adam Neville, Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk, Dark Matter by Michelle Paver, Foe by Ian Reid, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, Mary, An Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy, Suffer the Children by Craig DeLuey, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, The Witching Hour by Anne Rice, Cunning Folk, and Some Will Not Sleep, both by Adam Neville again, The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Augustina Bastarrica, Brother by Anya Alburn, Episode 13 by Craig DeLuey, and Children of Red Peak, again by Craig DeLuey, The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, White Horse by Erica T. Worth, What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher, The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Cole, Flowers from the Void by Gianni Washington, Such Sharp Teeth by Rachel Harrison, Goth by Otsuichi, The Room of Mourning by William Sloane, The Ruins by Scott Smith, Battle Royale by Koshiyuan Takami, Dark Water, Ring, Spiral, and Loop, all by Koji Suzuki, The Creeper by A.M. Shine, and The Watchers by A.M. Shine again, The Cabin at the End of the World, A Head Full of Ghosts, and The Beast You Are by Paul Tremblay, Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright, The Tooth Fairy by Graham Joyce, Song of Kali by Dan Simmons, Ghost Story by Peter Straub, Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson, Goddess of Filth by V. Castro, The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. And that does it for my entire horror book collection for what I have so far. Then getting into my manga section, we have my Junji Ito collection, Tomie, Uzumaki, and Gyo, Love Sickness, Shiver, Smashed, Suichi, Tombs, The Liminal Zone, and Venus in the Blind Spot, Orochi by Kazuo Mez, and Part 1 and Part 2 of The Drifting Classroom, PTSD Radio Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3 by Masaki Nakayama, Midoko-chan by Tomoki Izumi, Evil's Return Volume 1 and Volume 2, and then I also have the first 3 volumes in the Battle Royale manga adaptation. Innocent W Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3 by Kei Kisanoki, Sailor Moon Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3 by Naoka Takeuchi. And then finally for manga, I have my complete Claymore collection by Norihiro Yagi. Then we have my graphic novel collection, starting with Mouse by Art Spiegelman, Black Hole by Charles Burns, V for Vendetta by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, Batman The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley, The Crow Special Edition by James O'Barr, Batman Arkham Asylum by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean, The Elder Scrolls Official Cookbook by Chelsea Monroe Castle, and then lastly I have Dungeons & Dragons Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Getting on to my stacks now, I want to talk about some of my all-time favourite books. Firstly, we have Requiem for a Dream by Hubert Selby Jr. This was my first bout into proper transgressive literature, and there's no turning back for me. I absolutely adored this, despite how depressing and how bleak the story was. This was one that has stayed with me. His books always have the worst possible outcome for his characters, but knowing this and knowing how unique Shelby Jr.'s writing style actually is, just makes it so compelling to read. Because at the end of the day, who wants to actually read a happy story? Then I have Prozac Nation, Young and Depressed in America by Elizabeth Wurtzel, and this is a non-fiction that documents Elizabeth's experience with bipolar disorder, specifically in her college years and early to mid-20s. And I feel like it's a very accurate portrayal of bipolar disorder. And I read this at a time that I didn't know that I had it myself, but Now looking back on it, a lot of it makes sense, and I think it's always why I really related to this story. Next is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and this is absolutely incredible. If you haven't read this book yet, do it, regardless of whatever genre is your preference. If you like fantasy, if you like crime, if you like thrillers, if you like gothic, this has it all, and just such incredible storytelling. Then I have the autobiography of Malcolm X. This was probably the most profound and moving reading experience I've ever had. Definitely incredibly intense, but so wonderful, so wonderfully written. The introduction to it is also incredibly moving. And if you just know nothing about Malcolm X's life, you should definitely read this, especially if you're someone who loves kind of biographies and biopics and things. Next is House of Leaves by Marcy Danielewski. This is a book that I really had to work my way through multiple times in order to actually complete, but when you do complete it, you feel like you've conquered it, especially since the beginning it says this book is not for you. This book absolutely is for me. I gave it 5 stars. It was incredible. It had so many different horror elements to it. There was so much subtlety and so much genuine horror in it. And I feel like this book is often misunderstood and written off as gimmicky. Then I have my all-time favorite book, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is incredible. And don't just take it from me. Read the reviews. This book is everything that people say it is and more. It's incredible storytelling. The characters just jump off the page. It is absolutely worth reading the 1,000 and something pages that it's written on. It's just one of those books that you can't put down because you're always wondering what's going to happen next. Then there's The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. This is a book that I read really early on, and despite that, it's always remained one of my favourites. It's always stood out to me for the, I suppose you could say, body horror in it, but I reread it a couple of years ago and it still holds up. There are certain things that are in this that are absolutely nightmare inducing. It's not necessarily a horror novel, but there are certainly horrifying things within it. And then finally we have American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This was, for the longest time, before I read Count, was my favourite book of all time. This is the first book that I ever read that was like an adult book, and it really made an impact in my reading and my taste, and I just always put this book on a pedestal because I feel like without this book I wouldn't be the reader that I am today. Then getting into my priority TBR, these are books that I really want to read as soon as I can. First up we have Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. I still haven't read any of my Jane Austen books, and I don't know why. It's just this weird kind of procrastination thing that I'm doing. But this is the one I've been told multiple times to start with, so that's what I'm going to be starting with. I do believe I started it a couple of years ago and I just couldn't get my headspace into it at the time. Then we have The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. This is on my autumn TBR, so this is definitely going to get read during this segment of the year. And this just sounds really weird and odd, and that it's going to be a bit of a complex reading experience. Then I have Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson. So this is about werewolves, and it's one of those books that really locked in certain tropes that we associate these days with werewolves. And to be honest, I haven't really read much about werewolves. I feel like that's one of my blind spots, so I definitely need to read this as soon as I can. Then I have Rim of Morning by William Sloane. These are 2 short stories in this particular collection, and they both have cosmic horror elements and kind of dark academia elements from what I understand. This is meant to be a really underrated horror author. Next is The Terror of the Swallow by Andrew Sapkowski. This is the 6th book in the Witcher collection. So I really want to finish this series, but I've been hardcore procrastinating on it so much because I'm really enjoying it. So I tend to procrastinate on things that I enjoy, so I always have them to look forward to. Then I have A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I've attempted this several times and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to read it before the end of the year, specifically to do a reading vlog on, because I feel like you have to. Every time I pick it up, I'm like, I just don't want to be depressed right now. And then finally, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a book that I've been meaning to read for so long, and I'm still really hyped to read it. And I know I'm going to love the story because I love reading about absolute wretched characters. And for the last stack, I have Hidden Gems. These are books that I feel are really underrated or underread, and more people need to read them. So first up, we have The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. This is here just because it's the first ever horror novel ever written, and if you love horror, I feel like you should read it just based on that alone. It's actually not that difficult to read based on how old it is, and it is thoroughly entertaining. It is a little bit of its time, but the characters are so over the top and hysterical, and the storyline itself is actually quite good, and it really shows the origins of where Gothic horror came from. Then I have The Little Demon by Foider Sologub. This is about a teacher who is completely unhinged and things just go from bad to worse, but it's so entertaining to read because he's just such an awful person. And I feel like it's kind of relevant for today because there are so many teachers quitting their jobs because they can't deal with their unruly students. If you're someone who's in or interested in the teaching profession and you need a good laugh, check this out. Then there's Things We Say in the Dark by Kirsty Logan. This is a fantastic short story collection that focuses in on feminine and lesbian identities. It really goes from weird to weirder. You have to kind of trust the process when you start reading because the first one or two short stories in it are kind of off-putting with how in your face they are, but it really is a fantastic collection of kind of weird, unique little stories that really have you scratching your head by the end of it. Next is Slade House by David Mitchell. This is definitely a book that is not read enough within the horror community. This is like the perfect ghost story in my opinion. It's so eerie, it's so dark, there's such insidious notions behind it, and I just couldn't get enough when I read this. It's told through 5 stories that are all connected through Slade House itself, and once you start you are just going to be compelled to keep reading. Next is Invitation to a Beheading by Vladimir Nabokov. This is funny because this was actually ripped off from Kafka's The Trial. It's a very similar storyline, and when Nabokov was questioned on it, he was like, what? What story? Which? Who? Very shady, but this is probably the most anxiety-inducing yet entertaining books that I've read over the last couple of years. And if all you've read is Lolita by this author, you need to check out his other works. Then there's Ray Russell's Haunted Castles. This is one of my all-time favourite gothic short story collections. It is incredible and it really goes to show what modern gothic horror can do. The stories in it really stay with you, they play on your mind, they're the kind of stories that will keep you up at night, and I feel like this is so underhyped and more people need to read it. Then there's Children of Men by P.D. James. I feel like not enough people know that this story is actually based on a book, and the book makes so much more sense than the movie does. Like, I had a lot of questions when watching the movie, but when I finally got to reading the book, it really did make a lot of sense, and this is just a really well done dystopian tale that focuses in on like the horrors that can happen to women in these dystopian societies. Then I have I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. This is another female focused dystopian tale, horrifying, desolate. It will leave you absolutely haunted. I read this book last year or the year before last. It's still something that I regularly think about. It's still something that bothers me, but it's a great depiction on loss, confusion, and acceptance. And then finally, the last book I have to talk about is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw. Now, this got a lot of negative reviews from the horror community when it initially came out because, unfortunately, the prose just went over a lot of people's heads. So I feel like if you're coming from a classical literature background and you want to read some horror, this is a great place to start because you'll really appreciate the prose. The prose was beautiful, it was lyrical, and I can't recommend this enough, and it's just unfortunate that so many people didn't get it. So that has been my updated bookshelf tour for 2024. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it answered some of the questions as to what I have on my bookshelves. I definitely won't be leaving it 6 years before doing my next bookshelf tour. I'll try to do one once a year, probably around this time of year, just to show you how much the collection's growing, what's coming in, what's gone out. If you have any comments about it or questions that I didn't answer within the video, feel free to leave them below. And if you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my Instagram and TikTok, where I do short form bookish content that I don't necessarily share over here. And if you haven't already done so, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I'm really grateful for everyone who's done so and who continues to support my little channel. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.